Snow came early to Harrow Bend that winter, laying a hard white crust over fields and roofs in the churchyard. But the river below the Tilford bluff kept a dark eye open, a round of moving water that breathed steam like a living thing. Farmers tested the ice with poles and turned back at the warm belt, because the air there pricked the skin and smelled of iron, as if coins had been boiled under the surface. They said the river was odd before Luther and Amos Tilford bought the high pasture. Yet talk sharpened after the brothers raised their barn and set a windmill spinning day and night. The wheel clacked even when the breeze was dead, and sometimes the paddles kept a rhythm while the maples stood still, as if unseen hands wore the wind like a coat. People called the brothers hard workers, and it was true they rose before dawn and kept their heads down. But a wrongness followed them, the kind that makes a dog whine at an empty doorway. Luther had the neatness of small towns' respect. Amos listened more than he spoke and watched the size of a man's shadow. They smelled of iron even in July, and when winter came the scent sharpened, a damp metal note that turned the stomach. Yet if anyone mentioned it, they smiled with church manners and changed the subject. On the bluff their gates were so well oiled a child could lift them, yet livestock went missing without a track in the snow. A hog slipped through a slat one dusk and was never seen again, though the crust held every other print. 2 calves bawled until morning, then fell quiet as if a hand had settled over their mouths. The sheriff said wolves and blamed the cold for tricks of the eye. People stopped lingering at Tilford Place. Even the mail rider left letters at the gate because horses shied at the smell from the barn, a warm, wet breath in the dead of January. The windmill pumped into a timber shaft that vanished under the wall, and the ground around the footings never froze. When the sun touched that patch, thin fog slid toward the open water below. Washing lines caught the fog and gave it shape, and once it rolled over the schoolyard and left a taste on the tongue like rust and old bone. The preacher spoke of springs in the earth, and people nodded because faith is warmer than fear, but no one sent children over the ridge after dark. They kept simple stories because simple stories let a person sleep. They said warm springs, they said wolves, they said the brothers were odd but useful, and a body learns to live with a small lie the way a foot lives with a pebble in the boot. Only the river would not pretend. At night steam lifted and fell, and some swore there were shapes inside the glow, not faces but arrangements like faces, and when the steam broke, voices seemed thin and far, as if carried through a pipe. On the coldest morning in February, boys found fish along the edge of the warm circle, not frozen, not dead, simply still. They nudged them, and the fish twitched and swam away heavily, as if the water had thickened. Only the old miller kept his counsel. He watched the Tilford barn and saw no smoke from the chimney, though lamps burned in the loft. He saw the brothers feed their stove outside. He saw wooden covers over shallow pits near the windmill, hinges bright from use and edges damp when the air cracked with frost. Down at the bend the water lapped with a patient sound, steady as a clock. The miller thought of clocks and of how a clock does not care what it counts. It simply keeps time. The brothers had the same way about them, counting something the town could not name. Spring would carry thaw past the ferry, and people would say the bend had its reasons, but before the thaw the ground seemed to listen. Men spoke softer near the barn without choosing to, and the windmill clacked a beat that matched the pulse in the throat. The story of Luther and Amos had not yet broken open, but the seams were there, fine lines under paint, and the river kept its dark eye on the bluff, warm in a winter that wanted everything to freeze. They were polite in all the small ways that keep a town calm, and that made their wrongness harder to name. Luther tipped his hat, Amos carried parcels for widows. They stood for the hymn and bowed their heads when the preacher asked for mercy. Yet people stepped back when the brothers walked by because the air around them held a damp, metallic bite like wet coins warmed in a fist. In July, when shirts stuck to the spine and hog fat turned soft in the pantry, the brothers still smelled of iron, as if steam had passed through nails and settled in their coats. They made a habit of small talk that was never small. "How is your appetite? Are your gums sore this season? Have you been coughing at night? What do you weigh now compared with last harvest?" Folks laughed it off the first time, then found they were noting the answers later and could not say why. Luther watched with a bookkeeper's eye and seemed to write numbers in his head. Amos held silence the way a doctor holds a wrist, counting. A neighbor heard Luther say he had been reading about sailors who lasted longer at sea when salted meat was scarce, and wondered aloud whether the human body might keep better on certain diets. The neighbor remembered this later and wished he had not. The brothers were not cruel in public, they were careful. They did favors, they lent tools, they brought a pot of broth to a mother after her delivery, and asked what herbs the midwife had used, what was the color of the afterbirth, how many hours the pains had lasted. When a fever moved through the schoolhouse, they stood at the fence and asked about symptoms without touching the latch. After the fever, they each wore gloves for a month, and the gloves smelled new while their sleeves smelled old. Years later, when trunks were opened in a county office, men found letters with Luther's hand neat as a map, lines about the preservation of the human frame, about the ways water and air may be made to agree with flesh. He catalogued insects that did not come near certain oils. He named woods that slowed rot when wet. He noted that bodies stored high above damp ground kept their color longer. Amos did not write much, but his pencil worked the margins. Quiet sketches of frames with joints that locked at set angles, a rack that bent without splintering, a chair with a throat rest and a cup fixed under the tongue. None of it was proof of crime, only proof of attention. They were men who listened closely to the machine of the body and could tell when the engine missed a beat. They weighed people with their eyes, and their questions traced the outline of a person's weaknesses like a rub over a grave name. Cattlemen learned to judge stock by the shoulder and the flank. Luther and Amos judged their neighbors by pulse, breath, and breathlessness. At church suppers, the brothers served from the stew pot and asked what salt had been used and whether anyone felt a buzzing in the teeth from the spoon. Once, after a storm, they walked the path behind the old mill and gathered mushrooms only found on dead wood, then dried them over the stove until the kitchen smelled sour-sweet. They told anyone who asked that they were trying an old family remedy for preserving pork, and they smiled in a way that made the remark feel finished. In the barn, the windmill never stopped, and its pump sent a steady stroke down the shaft into the earth. Neighbors explained it as a deep spring that needed hard pulling. But at night, a different sound came with the clack, a slow hiss like air leaving a throat, and sometimes the light in the loft burned steady while the chimney gave no smoke. Children dared each other to peep through a crack and report what they saw, and most saw nothing but shadow and the swing of the mill belt. One boy said he saw a wooden arm that folded and unfolded by itself and thought it was the wind. The boy did not go back. Inside their house, shelves held jars of clear liquid with nails and bits of bone set inside to test whether the metal would bloom red or stay bright. Outside, the narrow shed kept quiet. Spring in Harrow Bend came slowly that year, the thaw reluctant, the ground still holding the cold of January even as the river loosened its grip on the banks. Clara Pike was last seen carrying a bundle of kindling along the path that skirted the bluff below the Tilford farm. She was small for 9, thin as a bird's shadow, with hair the color of chaff and a voice quick to laugh. Her mother said she would be home before the evening bell, but when the bell rang and the path lay empty, they lit lanterns and combed the river edge. Men pushed poles into the shallows, stirring silt, convinced she had slipped and been taken under. The Mississippi was a greedy thing, and it had swallowed better swimmers. The search went on for 3 days. then gave way to the slow acceptance people use to keep their hands steady. The river was blamed because the river could not answer back. Weeks later, when Mrs. Pike's grief had hardened into the quiet rhythm of daily chores, a boy sent to fetch apples from the Tilford root cellar returned pale and shaking. He said he had seen a little girl's bonnet folded on a barrel, dry and clean as if just taken from a drawer. It was pale blue with a ribbon that matched the one Clara had worn. Luther told the boy he was mistaken and shut the cellar door himself. Word spread, but the sheriff, who played cards with Luther and drank his whiskey on Sundays, said the boy was stirring trouble and warned people to leave it alone. In small towns, fear learns to fold itself small enough to fit in a pocket. That summer, the Tilford chimney gave no smoke. Weeks of warm days and cool nights passed without a single curl from the stovepipe. Though the farm's windmill clacked without pause, its blades turned under clear skies, pumping water down into the barn with the patience of a clock measuring something no one else could see. Neighbors passing on the ridge at dusk noticed the earth by the barn was always damp. The dark soil pressed in shallow channels toward a gap beneath the wall. Dogs taken near it pulled hard to leave, hackles raised, as if the ground itself whispered in a tone only they could hear. What Clara's disappearance marked was not a crime that could be chased by hoof and lantern, but a shift in the air around the Tilfords. Their silences thickened, and their gazes seemed to weigh people a fraction longer. Luther spoke less in town, Amos not at all, yet the pump's beat grew more constant, as though it had been tied to their own pulse. In later years, when men stood over the wreck of the barn and tried to make sense of what they found, they would recall that summer and the way the Tilford's routines tightened. Tools disappeared from fence rails and returned polished, the smell of wet iron drifting from the barn even on dry days. No one then could guess that the brothers had learned how to erase a body without fire or grave. They had no need to burn, no need to dig. They had found that water, drawn deep and passed through certain mixtures, could strip the body of the signals that called decay to it. Flesh softened into a weightless texture, organs losing their form without smell, skin kept in place not by life but by a slow tightening of fibers under the influence of their solution. By the time anyone thought to look, there was nothing to point at. No bone, no blood, no stain in the straw, only damp soil and the turning of the wheel above it. The river might have been innocent of Clara Pike's death, but it took the blame because people needed the comfort of an old enemy. The truth, that something on the bluff could take a living child and leave behind nothing the world recognized as human, was too large for their minds to hold. And so the wheel turned day and night, as the brothers refined their method, watching the river warm below them, its black surface breathing faint steam into the summer air. They were learning how to make a life vanish as though it had never been, a skill they would soon use again, with a precision that felt less like murder and more like the careful practice of a craft. In the loft above the Tilford barn, where dust hung thick in the air and the scent of resin clung to the rafters, stood a line of frames that no one in Harrow Bend would have believed could exist. They were not crude stockades or gallows, but careful constructions of wood rubbed smooth with oil, padded in places with cured leather so the skin would not tear. The clamps were jointed and could turn at angles that bent the body into unnatural postures without breaking bone. Some frames were narrow, meant for a single form. Others were wide enough to hold several side by side, each fixed so close the curve of one shoulder nearly brushed another. They had the clean precision of a carpenter's pride, yet the purpose behind them had nothing to do with craft for beauty's sake. Luther and Amos Tilford had learned something that no decent mind would want to know: that the human body could be made to stiffen and hold itself in life like a statue if its muscles were locked in certain sequences and its breath was dosed with the right vapors. The brothers worked this discovery the way a musician works a scale, repeating it until they could produce the result without error. Their loft became a testing ground where the air was thick with the bitter green smell of crushed herbs, and the sweet rot of plants left to steep in sealed jars. They found that if the muscles of the neck and spine were kept rigid and the diaphragm pinned at just the right degree of tension, the body would settle into a state that was neither rest nor struggle. The victim remained awake, eyes fixed, but the body was held so still that the beat of the heart slowed to a crawl, the blood moving as if through cooled honey. It was not a mercy. It was a slow theft of every impulse to move, every reflex that belonged to being alive. The brothers called it preservation, but it was more than that. It was possession. A body held this way could not speak or resist, yet its senses remained raw and open. They knew this because they tested it. A finger drawn along the skin of the arm would raise goose flesh. The eyes would widen slightly at a sudden sound. A tear might slip down the cheek hours after the breath had been steadied. The brothers watched these small responses with the patient hunger of men tending a rare plant. Some they kept in this state for days, some for weeks, feeding them only when the pulse dropped too low, tilting the head back to pour liquid between unmoving lips. Death came not from injury, but from the unbearable patience of the heart forced to move at half its pace for too long. When the body could no longer keep time with this artificial stillness, it simply stopped, and the head would bow forward like a puppet cut from its string. Those who died this way showed no bruising, no torn skin, no broken bones. Their muscles were locked in death the way they had been in life, as if the frame had imprinted its shape into them. To the Tilfords, this was a triumph. It meant they could display a living person as if they were a preserved specimen, a breathing artifact that defied decay. They began arranging their captives in ways that pleased their strange sense of order, hands folded, heads tilted in identical angles, bodies placed in mirrored positions. They took notes on how long each could be held before the eyes lost their clarity, before the skin began to sag, before the will to keep the heart beating finally gave way. Neighbors passing the barn at night might hear nothing more than the steady pump of the windmill and the occasional creak of wood settling in the loft. But inside, the brothers were perfecting a ritual they believed could hold life suspended, as if time itself could be tricked into pausing. In their minds, this was not cruelty. It was mastery. The power to decide exactly how long a person could remain in the fragile space between breath and silence, and the authority to choose when that space would end. And while the river below kept its warm, dark circle through the winter, the loft above the barn kept its own kind of unnatural season, one where nothing truly moved, yet nothing ever truly stopped. On a moonless night in late autumn, a traveling preacher making his way to Harrow Bend claimed he had seen figures in the Tilford barn. He had stopped on the bluff road to water his horse when a dim, yellow light spilled through the barn's high slats. In that thin glow, he made out rows of people standing against the far wall, their faces pale, their eyes wide and fixed forward. They did not shift, did not blink, and their stillness carried the heavy weight of something unnatural. To the preacher, they looked like wax effigies posed for display, but as the lamplight flickered, he swore one's chest rose slowly, as if drawing in the smallest possible breath. He hurried on, unsettled, and when he shared the vision in town the next day, his story was met with laughter. Harrow Bend had little patience for outsiders' warnings, especially when they spoke against men as outwardly respectable as the Tilfords. The sheriff dismissed it as a trick of shadows, the mind seeing life where there was none. Yet the preacher's unease followed him. He left town before the week was out, heading downriver with the frost at his heels. He never made it to his next stop. His body was found days later lying on the Mississippi bank 2 miles south. perfectly intact despite having been exposed to the elements. His skin was cool but not cold, his eyes bright as though death had only just passed over him. The county doctor, puzzled, noted the absence of the usual signs. No discoloration, no stiffening of limbs, no smell of rot. He was buried quickly without further questions, though the quiet spread across town like fog. Behind the barn doors, the Tilfords were advancing their work. Those who stood in the preacher's sight line that night were not dead. They were living subjects, fixed into a state of frozen endurance by the brothers' methods, eyes open to the world but powerless to leave it. Some had been standing for days, others had only just been placed. The brothers moved among them like curators in a gallery, adjusting a head's tilt, smoothing a sleeve, touching a cheek to feel for the faintest warmth. The windmill's pump kept its rhythm, and the barn air stayed heavy with the resin and herb vapors that lulled muscles into their long surrender. When a subject's time ran out, the brothers did not dispose of them in the usual way. The perfected ones, those who held their form even in death, were kept as part of the collection. The failures were carried down to the river in the dark, lowered in weighted frames until the water covered them completely. The warmth of the bend fed on these offerings, the chemical leaching from flesh into the current. To the Tilfords, this was a necessary cycle. One life to refine the process, another to feed the river that seemed to guard their secret. The preacher's words faded from local memory within a season, reduced to the mutterings of a stranger who had passed through and left nothing behind. But the brothers remembered him well, not because his story reached the town, but because for the briefest moment someone had seen what they were building, and understood that it was not a vision of the past or future, but a still terrible present. By the spring of 1830, the Tilfords no longer thought of their work as an experiment. They called it a craft, though no one outside the barn knew its name. In the loft and the lower stalls, they had perfected a process that made fire and earth unnecessary. There was no need to burn a body to ash, no need to bury it in secret ground. Instead, they learned to pull the body into a state that cheated decay, not embalming, not freezing, but a kind of suspended hour in which death did not advance and life did not retreat. The method began long before the subject was still. Certain plants crushed into a paste and left too steep in river water gave off vapors that slowed the heartbeat when breathed in. A thin resin drawn from boiled roots was brushed along the skin to seal the pores. Beneath it, the body's heat cooled slowly as though time had been convinced to move at half its pace. The brothers watched for signs that the change had taken hold. The subtle glaze over the eyes, the breath that came shallow and far apart, the muscles firming without the stiffness of true death. Once the balance was set, they could hold it for days, even weeks, so long as the subject remained in their controlled air and drank only the bitter infusion they provided. This was the state they prized most, not living in any way a person would recognize, not dead in any way a doctor could sign for. It was an in-between place, a border the brothers believed only they could navigate. Luther recorded the temperature of the loft each hour, marking how long before the first changes in skin tone appeared. Amos refined the arrangement of the frame so the body's weight was evenly distributed, keeping blood from pooling, keeping the face smooth and unmarked. They took pride in the fact that a person kept like this could appear to be merely asleep, even as their hearts slowed to the edge of stopping. Those who passed beyond that edge were dealt with in silence. The perfected bodies, the ones whose skin stayed warm and whose limbs held their pose, were kept, arranged, and sometimes moved to new positions as though they were part of a permanent exhibit. Others, those who failed the process or showed signs of collapse, were removed before any odor could betray them. The river bend received these quietly. The brothers had designed iron frames with vents so that the water could work through them, leaching what remained into the current without tearing the form apart. Weeks later, when the frame was pulled back, there would be little more than a pale husk, light enough to carry in one hand. To the Tilfords, this was not destruction. It was a kind of offering, a way to return imperfect work to the same element that had inspired them. They believed the river warmed for them because they gave it these remains, that its constant open water in winter was a sign their pact was understood. Whether this was superstition or truth mattered little. The warmth remained, and their secrecy endured. Outside the bluff, life in Harrow Bend went on. People married, children were born, and the memory of Clara Pike's disappearance faded into one more cautionary tale told near the hearth. The sheriff still stopped by the Tilford's gate for a drink. The postman still left letters without stepping inside, and no one asked why the barn never smelled of livestock. The windmills turning was the only constant sign, and even that was easy to ignore if a person wanted peace. But inside, the brothers' ambitions had sharpened. They no longer sought to see if their process would work. They knew it did. Now they were trying to see how far it could go, how long the space between a person's last breath and the final stillness could be stretched before nature reclaimed what was hers. In their minds, they were not killers but keepers, men with the skill to hold life as steady as a stone in the riverbed. And as long as the river stayed warm, they believed the work would never end. The summer of 1831 came hot and airless, pressing down on Harrow Bend until the leaves curled and the soil cracked in the fields. On a Thursday afternoon, the widow Marjorie Crane sent her eldest boy Thomas to fetch salt pork from the trading post. He was 14, tall for his age, with a quick stride that made him seem older. He took the ridge path that ran past the Tilford property, a shortcut he had walked many times before. He never returned. By dusk, Marjorie was on the road calling his name, her voice breaking in the heavy air. Neighbors lit lanterns and searched along the river, through the mill yard and up toward the bluff. No sign. The sheriff wrote his report that night in a tired hand, adding Thomas's name to the short but troubling list of those the town had quietly lost. For weeks, Marjorie kept to her porch, scanning the ridge at dawn and dusk, waiting for a figure to appear on the path. Then one evening near the harvest moon, she swore she saw him. In the upper window of the Tilford house, a face she knew as well as her own looked down at her. Pale, still, framed by the glass as if set in a portrait. His Sunday shirt was buttoned to the throat, his eyes open but strangely fixed. She shouted his name and started toward the house, but by the time she reached the gate, the window was empty. Luther stepped out to meet her, hat in hand, polite as ever, saying she must have mistaken a shadow for her boy. His voice was steady, his face calm, but she noticed the faint metallic tang in the air. She told anyone who would listen, but the sheriff only shook his head. People said grief played tricks, that the heat and her sleepless nights had put ghosts into her vision. Marjorie refused to let it go. Then 2 weeks later, just before dawn, she opened her door and found Thomas standing on her porch. He did not knock. He did not speak. He was upright, his arms hanging at his sides, eyes wide and unblinking. For a heartbeat, she thought he had come home alive. But when she reached for him, the illusion shattered. His body folded in on itself, collapsing into her arms with no more weight than a bundle of wet cloth. His skin was warm but soft, yielding in ways no living flesh should. The smell of iron rose from him, sharp and unnatural. She screamed and the neighbors came running, but by then he was nothing but a ruin of himself, the shape of a boy with nothing solid left inside. The doctor, summoned in haste, found no cause he could name, no injury, no sign of illness, Yet the tissue beneath the skin seemed to have dissolved, as though something had eaten away the structure that held him upright. He was buried before sunset, the coffin sealed tight. Marjorie sat by the grave for days, refusing food, her face hardening into the mask of someone who had seen the truth and knew no one would believe it. In the barn, the Tilfords took careful notes. Thomas had been one of their most promising trials, his body holding the preserved state longer than any before him. But the frame had failed to keep his internal structure intact after removal from the loft's controlled air. Without the constant influence of their resin and vapors, the muscles slackened and the body gave way. To them, this was not loss. It was progress. They had learned that preservation was not just about halting decay, but about maintaining the architecture of the body even outside their reach. Amos drew a new design in the margin of Luther's ledger. A portable brace hidden under clothing to hold a subject in perfect form until they could be displayed. The town spoke of Thomas for a while, then folded his story into the quiet that surrounded all the disappearances. No one challenged the Tilfords openly. Their gates stayed oiled, their windmill kept turning, and the river bend stayed warm as though it knew each life that had been poured into it. But Marjorie kept her blinds drawn toward the bluff, certain that the window in the Tilford house still watched her in return. When the barn finally gave up its secrets decades later, the harvest room was the one place even seasoned men refused to enter twice. It lay behind a false wall at the far end of the loft, the entrance masked by stacked feed barrels and a plank door without a visible latch. Inside, the air was dense and resin-sweet, heavy enough to make the lungs ache. The walls were lined with shelves and rails, but not for tools or tack. Here, the Tilfords had arranged their preserved subjects with a precision that bordered on worship. Each body stood or sat in deliberate positions, clothed in garments that seemed chosen for the story they told. Children in faded spring dresses and short pants, and posed with hands folded neatly in their laps, were grouped together in one corner the brothers had labeled Spring. Across from them, pairs of men and women, some clasping hands, others with their faces turned toward each other in a frozen exchange, were dressed in light fabrics, their hair adorned with flowers that had long since turned brittle. These were summer. Autumn was more solemn, elders wrapped in shawls, their eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. They stood in rows like witnesses to a final procession. The last section, winter, was the most disturbing. Strangers with faces unfamiliar to the town, all clothed in dark, heavy garments, their heads bowed as if in mourning. Each bore the faint sheen of the resin that had kept them intact, their skin neither fully alive nor convincingly dead. Luther's records found in a desk near the room's center described the collection in clinical terms. Each entry noted the date of harvest, the time the subject had been placed in the frame, the precise mixture of herbs and minerals used, and the length of time the body had maintained its form. Amos's sketches showed plans for new arrangements, adjustments to posture, and even mock-ups for seasonal group photographs. Drawings that suggested the brothers had intended the collection to grow indefinitely. The room's temperature had been regulated by vents from the windmill shaft, keeping the air cool and saturated with the faintest mist of river water mixed with their chemical blend. The floor beneath the displays was layered with a powdery mineral that absorbed moisture, preventing mold or insects from disturbing the scene. It was, in every sense, a gallery, not of art, but of human lives taken and preserved according to an order only the Tilfords understood. To anyone else, the sight was grotesque, but in the brothers' minds, these were not victims. They were specimens perfected through method, arranged in a calendar of life stages, locked forever in the season the Tilfords had chosen for them. There was no randomness, no cruelty without reason, only the quiet satisfaction of men who believed they had mastered the passage of time within flesh. The harvest room was never meant to be seen by anyone outside their blood. Yet standing in that space, decades later, investigators could feel the care with which it had been tended. Dust lay evenly as though disturbed only by deliberate hands. The air still carried the faint scent of the resin, and the bodies, some placed there over 20 years before the fire, remained as they had been, untouched by decay. It was not just a room of the dead, it was a shrine to stillness, the ultimate proof that the Tilfords had achieved what they set out to do, to stop life in place and hold it there, untouched by the natural order for as long as they desired. And behind the closed door, with only the windmill's pulse and the river's warm breath to bear witness, the brothers had stood among their seasons like keepers of an unholy garden. The Mississippi bend below the Tilford bluff never froze, not in the deepest January, not even when the rest of the river locked tight under sheets of ice thick enough to hold a wagon. People called it a quirk of the current or a pocket of warm spring water, but the brothers knew it was fed by more than nature. The warmth was theirs, sustained by the offerings they lowered into its depths under moonless skies. Every failed subject, every body that could not be perfected, was sealed inside a vented iron frame weighted with stone, then guided down the slope to the waiting dark. The water swallowed them with a sound almost too soft to hear, and within days the warmth spread outward in a slow, invisible bloom. The frames were not cages of punishment. They were tools of transformation. Amos had designed them with narrow slits so the water could work through the body without tearing it apart. Minerals from the remains, mingled with the brothers' resin and herbal compounds, leached into the current, setting off a reaction they swore they could feel in the air. The bend's surface would shiver for hours afterward, and by morning a thin steam would rise even in the coldest dawn. Luther believed the river returned something in exchange, a kind of vitality that fed the preservation work in the barn. In their ledgers, the process was recorded as the River Pact, a term written without explanation, as if both men knew its meaning too well to describe. They never spoke of it aloud, even to each other, but their routines told the story. The descent from the barn to the river's edge was always slow, careful, and silent. No lanterns were carried. The path was memorized in darkness. At the waterline, they would stand for a moment before letting the frame slide under, watching until the last ripple faded. They left no markers, but they knew where each offering lay by heart, mapping them as one might tend to the rows of a private cemetery. The warmth of the bend became a constant they could rely on, a quiet guardian that kept the rest of the river's ice at bay and discouraged the curious. Fishermen avoided it, saying the taste of the water there was wrong, and that the few fish caught in its circle seemed too still, their movements sluggish even when pulled into the air. The Tilfords counted that as another gift. Fewer eyes, fewer questions. Over time, the brothers began to believe the bend's warmth was not only a result of their work, but a requirement for it. They noticed that when they fed the river more often, the preservation process in the barn grew easier, the resin setting faster, the subjects lasting longer in their perfected state. In winters, when the river received less, the work slowed and more bodies failed. To them, it was proof of a living exchange, a silent agreement between their craft and the water below. If the town ever suspected the truth, it never voiced it. Children were told not to wander near the warm bend, and stories about its dangers passed from one generation to the next, stripped of detail until they became simple warnings about thin ice and deep currents. But the brothers' eyes saw the bend for what it was, a hidden partner, patient and accepting, that took what they gave it and returned something they could not measure but felt in every successful preservation. In the stillest nights, when frost silvered the fields and the windmill's pulse slowed to a steady lull, the brothers would walk to the bluff's edge and watch the steam drift up from the water. Neither spoke, but both understood. The river was as much a part of their work as the resin, the frames, and the air in the harvest room. And so the pact held, unspoken and unbroken, as the warm bend kept its open eye through every winter, guarding what lay beneath. By the winter of 1834, Harrow Bend had grown used to the disappearances, though no one said so aloud. The names were fewer each year, but only because people learned to keep to certain paths, to avoid the bluff after dark, and to turn away from the warm bend as though it were a stranger's stare. Still, by midwinter there were 12 who had vanished without a trace, and not a single grave to mark them. That January the cold came hard and sudden, snapping branches and sealing the fields in ice. Yet the bend below the Tilford farm still breathed steam into the air. One morning, after a snowfall so deep it muffled the whole valley, a hunter from the north side tracked deer across the ridge and down toward the bluff. The prints in the snow were fresh, sharp-edged, and the hunter expected to see the animal break from the trees ahead. Instead, he came upon a figure standing knee-deep in the drift, not moving, not shivering, her eyes wide and glass-bright. It was a woman dressed thinly for the cold, her skin flushed but dry, her breath so shallow it barely disturbed the frost on her lips. She looked at him but did not speak, her gaze fixed like a painting's. When he touched her arm, the flesh was warm and firm as though she had been standing there for only a moment. He carried her back to town in a kind of stunned obedience to the situation, but by the time they reached the doctor's porch, she had gone limp in his arms. She died within the hour, yet her skin stayed warm through the night and her limbs resisted the stiffness that comes after death. The doctor, baffled, noted no signs of injury, no frostbite, no cause he could name. Her body was buried quickly, and the town made no effort to link her to the other vanishings, though some whispered that she must have come from the bluff. In the barn loft, the brothers marked the day in their ledger with a single word: release. She had been kept for weeks, standing in one of their angled frames, breathing the vapors that slowed her pulse to a faint echo. They had intended to bring her into the harvest room, but she had shown signs of a strain they could not correct. Luther decided she should be let go into the cold to see how long the stillness would hold without their care. The fact that she had remained upright and warm for hours after removal pleased them both, proof that their preservation could extend beyond the barn walls. The hunter's report spread through town, but without evidence to name the Tilfords, it was left to sit among the other strange tales of the season. The sheriff dismissed it as a case of exposure and confusion, but the hunter never returned to the bluff, nor did he hunt that ridge again. For the brothers, the experiment marked a turning point. They began to see the preserved not just as fixed objects for their collection, but as potential figures that could be placed in the world for others to encounter. Living statues whose stillness might outlast the winter. In this they saw a new layer to their craft, a way to prove the permanence of their methods under the harshest conditions. That winter, the town's fear reached a quiet peak. People avoided the bluff entirely, the warm bend untouched by human eyes except the brothers. The steam from the water rose higher in the frigid air, curling toward the barn loft where the windmill's steady pulse kept time with the river below. And in the loft, under the glow of their lamps, Luther and Amos worked with the calm of men who knew their skill was approaching perfection. Men for whom the line between life and death had become no more than the thin, cold air of a Missouri winter's night. By late March of 1835, the wind held from the south, carrying mill smoke up to the bluff and laying it over the Tilford place like a thin sheet. The barn had stood 7 years without a board out of place. Yet that month neighbors noticed a fiercer glow in the loft after sundown and a sharper bite in the air. Resin and iron together, the smell of a workshop readying for a new test. On the night the fire began, the fields were still and the stars were clean. Somewhere a spark found varnish and ran a rail like a fuse. By the time a farmhand turned at the change in scent, orange had settled behind the slats and was licking upward with quick, bright tongues that night. People ran because running is what you do when the first light shows. They came with buckets and hooks shouting up the hill, but the oiled gates swung without a sound and there was no one to meet them. Through the high slats they saw shapes in the glow, a row of figures along the loft wall, motionless and pale as smoke curled past. Up the ladder the heat hit like a hand, frames lined the loft like black ribs, and among them the preserved stood unblinking, eyes mirrored fire. Then the ridge let go and the west wall folded with a roar. Men who had climbed halfway felt something in them fail and went back down without knowing why. By the time the bucket line found its rhythm, the loft floor had given way in sections. Boards plunged to the stalls and burst into embers that smelled not of animal but of bitter herbs, pitch, and hot iron. The windmill slowed, then halted. One paddle hanging at a wrong angle, the belt burned through. Those at the house found the kitchen door unlatched and Luther on the floor with one arm tucked under him. Skin darkened but not split, mouth set in the same neat line he wore in life. Amos lay near the back step, palm open toward the yard. Neither showed the black crumble fire leaves on common flesh. They looked baked rather than burned, as if heat had hardened them without breaking the surface. Morning showed what the night had hidden. The barn had fallen to a low ridge of ember. Sun struck the heap and ash lifted in threads, showing what the fire had spared. Warped frames still standing, clamps locked at the notch meant for a throat, a row of forms in the west corner not reduced, faces smooth as if sleep had laid a hand there. The sheriff said to fetch wagons. No one moved for a long breath. Rumor settled as fast as cinders. Some said lightning had walked the ridge. Others said a hand inside had done it. That the brothers had chosen to end their work or to prove one last point. The river sent up more steam than any winter morning had shown. A white rise that fed talk of a pact paid in full. Behind the burned wall, 3 steps of the loft stair still held. Under them lay a ledger in a tin box, edges scorched, pages whole, mixtures and temperatures, times kept to the minute, notes on posture and angle, on how faces keep calm when weight is spread just so. Beside the box lay a key wrapped in oiled cloth. It found a hidden panel and a door side open on ruined hinges. Even with smoke whispering from the joists, the air within carried the bittersweet breath of resin and mineral. Those who stepped inside did so with the steps of men in a church. They saw rows that had held for years and rows just set, and understood the fire had not erased the work so much as announced it. The sheriff counted 2 bodies for the brothers and many more for the unnamed, sent a rider for the judge, and told teams to wait. Down at the bend, the steam kept lifting, and the surface shivered as if something moved below. By sundown, the yard was quiet except for the ticking of hot nails as they cooled. What remained would be taken up and carried, set down and written, and the town that had lived by silence would learn new words for what had been done. And from the edge of the ash, where the frames still made their dark ribs against the light, the next hard task waited in plain view. The morning after the fire, men with ash on their boots pried open what the flames had spared and found the room that would not surrender its dead. The air inside was cool and sticky, sweet with resin. On rails and chairs and frames, the preserved stood and sat. Their faces were smooth, their eyelids unblistered. Heat had browned the rafters and curled the ledger's edges, yet skin that should have split stayed whole, and mouths that should have gaped were sealed with a clear glaze. A doctor touched a wrist and felt nothing, but the skin yielded like fruit that had not turned. He pressed again and the flesh rose back slowly, holding shape. There was no smell of rot, only the same damp metal breath that clung to the barn in winter. One child's lashes held a flake of ash. When it fell, the eye beneath looked glass bright. Hands were arranged in matching folds, and under each heel lay a pinch of powder the color of bone. They lowered some to the floor and found the joints moved as if the bodies were new to death, but the inner weight felt wrong, light in one place and heavy in another. Heat had melted the resin at the lips and left a clean seam the length of the mouth. Under that seam, the tongues were dry and hard as sticks. 9 were brought out before noon, then 11 more, and still the room gave them up, a season at a time. The sheriff tied a scarf over his nose and read names where names could be guessed, then gave up and counted instead. By dusk, the yard held row after row on doors laid flat, faces turned to the same gray sky. Behind the rows, the warm bend sent up a steady breath that drifted across the yard, and people kept glancing toward it without meaning to, as if the river itself were listening. The judge, pale and silent, watched from his saddle and signed the order with a hand that shook slowly. It was decided without debate that no family could keep a single one. Whatever had been done here would not be carried into parlors and pews. A grave was ordered on the hill above the bend where spring floods never reached, a long trench cut clean through clay. Some argued for quicklime, others said the soil should hold them plain. In the end, both were used, lime for the outer edges, raw clay for the center, boards laid across and dirt tamped hard. Men worked until their arms shook. Women stood in a ring and prayed without words. The town slept that night as if a lid had been set over a pot, but the room had not finished speaking. Spring rains came early the next year, soft at first, then heavy, and water found old paths through the bluff. It did not reach the trench, only kissed its base, yet by midsummer children picking berries along the slope saw a pale oval in the cut bank like a moon behind a cloud. It was a face intact, the hair still bound with a ribbon that had kept its color. When men opened the trench again, the boards were wet, the lime at the edges gone to paste, the clay in the middle firm as the day it was packed. They lifted 3 from the top row and laid them in the sun. Nothing had changed. Skin held tone, eyes held shape, mouths held their sealed lines. What should have yielded to time had held against it. The trench was closed once more, but the lesson stayed. The Tilfords had not only denied decay under a roof, they had taught it to hesitate even in the ground. From that day, the town kept the hill clear and the path fenced, and the ledgers and frames went into county storage with locks on their lids. The next step would not be science and not comfort, but law. Because Harrow Bend had learned that a silence kept too long becomes a shelter. And shelters must be taken down board by board before the river forgets the names under the clay. The first change was not anger, but order. By week's end, a River Circuit judge wrote an emergency rule in a hotel ledger, the courthouse still sour with smoke, and the rule was plain. Every death would be seen by a county doctor, logged in ink and laid into ground or fire within 36 hours. No private rooms, no keeping, no experiments by any name. People called it the quiet law because it arrived without speeches, only signatures and keys. A coroner's post was created from the mill tax. A clerk stamped the hour on each page. The old sheriff left. A new one walked the ridge with a lamp and a book, and barns, cellars, and smokehouses were opened for inspection. Some rooms were only dust, but others gave up jars with resin stained into the glass and rails polished by straps. These were listed and boxed, then carried to the county storage where the ledgers and frames already sat under lock. Word ran east. A month later, a circular from Jefferson City urged every township to copy Harrow Bend. No still rooms, no long keeping, a doctor's mark on the toe tag, fines for delay, seizure of devices that claimed to preserve human flesh. The circular never named the brothers, but everyone knew. Undertakers from St. Louis taught cleaner practice and sold coffins with vents. The churchyard painted a board that said, "We bury on time." Mothers held children closer at dusk. Men spoke names in church that they had avoided because law lets shy tongues walk a straight path. At the warm bend, a fence went up with iron posts and simple signs that said, "Keep back." Schoolmasters spoke of thin ice and deep water and said nothing about frames asleep under silt. The hill grave was edged with stone. Wildflowers appeared along its top from hands that did not wish to be known. On Sundays, some stood at the fence, watched the steam rise, and turned away because the water did not care about any order and showed it. The barn ash went to the ferry road. The resin smell faded but did not go. The new sheriff logged his rounds to the minute as if time itself needed a witness. There were quiet fights. A tinker asked after the county store of chemicals and was told to leave by sundown. A farmer claimed his jars were for pork and lost them to seizure anyway. In court, the judge allowed no curses, only lists and measures. He called the ordinance a duty to the living and a guard for the dead, and in that narrow way the town agreed. The school added a lesson on decay, not to frighten children, but to teach what should happen and what should never be forced to stop. River captains received notice. No dumping unknown fluids, no night landings at the warm bend, fines fixed and public. Even with new rules, people avoided the brothers' names. They said that house, that bluff, that room, their mouths tightened at Tilford. In shops and parlors, the word Tilfording took root as a warning. Do not keep what must be let go. When a man sat too long in grief, a friend might touch his sleeve and murmur, "None of that now." And he would nod because he heard both meanings. Habit became custom, custom became law, and in the slow way small places change, Harrow Bend learned to look in on itself. Once a year, 2 men and a minister counted the frames and signed a line that said, "All present." The river did not change. Winter came and the warm eyes stayed open, steam lifting and falling like breath. The fence rusted and was painted again. The signboards warped and were replaced. The quiet law held not because it was grand, but because loss had taught the town that silence cannot be trusted. Order became the shape their grief could bear. The work ahead would be memory and watchfulness. Neither could chill the bend, but the town kept them anyway, because some evils end in a room and some keep walking the road, and only one kind can be met with paper, ink, and the steady habit of light. It would have to do. Nearly 2 centuries later, the bluff looks smaller, softened by weather and scrub. But the fence still runs its line above the warm bend, and the sign still says "Keep back" in letters. Repainted so often the grooves feel carved. The barn is gone. A low rectangle of stone marks where the sill beam sat, and sorghum grows in the field where the windmill used to turn. School buses slow on the ridge, and children watch the thin steam curl off the water on cold mornings. When it drifts over the ditch, the driver lifts a hand to the window as if to test the air, then drives on. The hill grave is trimmed each spring. Some years a vase appears with wildflowers, some years only a small jar of clean river stones, each one set down with care on the packed clay. The names most people remember are a few pulled from ledgers and from marks on old clothes, but most of the dead have no names left, only the seasons they were placed in, and the town keeps them as a single sentence that no one wants to say aloud. Visitors come with careful steps. They read the plaque that tells the story without telling it, and they too want to look down at the water that will not freeze. Inside the county museum, a single case holds the ledgers, the oiled key, a clamp, and a jar whose glass is clouded at the lip. Cards explain in plain words what came from these objects. A doctor must see every dead person within a day. Ground or fire must take the body without delay. Private keeping is a crime. Devices that halt decay will be seized, fines and jail for those who refuse. The quiet law spread downriver and across counties until it was part of the code, written in calm lines that do not say the brothers' names. Undertakers learn better practice. Nurses are taught to watch for signs that a room is being kept too still. The churchyard added a bench, and it faces the hill rather than the river because the living prefer to watch what can be changed. Scientists came twice in the last 40 years to test what could be tested. They shaved a thread from the resin seam on a preserved sleeve and warmed it and said the mix was old oils, ash, and plants from the riverbank. They weighed soil from the grave and said water holds there differently than other places on the hill. They wrote papers with quiet titles and went away. None of it changed the fact that the bend refuses ice or that fish move slower in its circle. The town listens, nods, and goes back to watching winter breathe from the black water. Faith explains what science cannot, and habit does what faith cannot reach. The people live with it. They marry, work, and age, but they keep small habits the story taught. Windows are opened when someone dies so the house can breathe. Candles are not kept near photographs. Children are told that kindness is not the same as trust. When a neighbor is too smooth and too helpful, an old woman in line may whisper to mind the still ones and no one asks her to explain. The word Tilfording survives as a warning said soft, meaning do not hold what should pass. Do not praise a silence that lasts too long. Once a year, the school brings students to the museum in the hill. The guide speaks in a voice made simple on purpose. He says the brothers were men who hid their harm in good manners, and that the town helped them by looking away, and that law is a promise you make to those who cannot speak for themselves. The students nod and stare at the case where the clamp lies on green felt, and a few watch the guide's hands as if they expect them to move by themselves. From the bluff at dusk, the water looks like any other water. But the people who live here know that evil did not roar in this place. It wore a neat collar and a clean hat. It asked about appetite and sleep and whether a person had lost weight. It said please, and it kept a ledger. It hid inside stillness and used politeness as a coat. A monster that rages is simple to see. A neighbor who helps carry a trunk while counting your steps with his eyes is harder. The brothers taught the town that harm can be arranged like furniture and then left in place so no one thinks to move it. That is why the fence is painted each year. That is why the key to the storage room is signed out and back with care. The brothers are long gone, but the idea is not. Somewhere there is always someone who wants to slow a heart for the sake of control. To hold time still so they can keep a thing that should change. The tools look different now. They may be numbers on a screen, locks on a door, rules written to sound like help. Stillness remains the trick. Keep people from moving, speaking, or being seen, and you can do much to them while the river of days flows past. The lesson of Harrow Bend is not only about death, it is about attention. Watch the rooms where the air never stirs. Watch the plans that make every face look the same. Watch the places where nothing seems to move. In winter, the steam lifts tall and the bell on the hill is quiet under frost, and the town feels the weight of what was learned. Memory is not justice, but it is a guard at the gate. The law will hold so long as hands keep painting the fence and eyes keep counting the boxes and mothers keep naming the lost where others would rather not say the names. The river will do what it wants. Evil waits in silence. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could.